October 2, 1941, Western Russia. The ground is still dry, the nights already cold, and the German columns begin to move before dawn. Engines rumble in long, disciplined lines, headlights hooded, orders short and final. This is not another advance. This is the one that matters. If it works, the war in the East may end before winter. If it fails, Germany will be fighting a different war than the one it planned. The operation has a name, Operation Typhoon, and its objective is simple enough to say out loud. Take Moscow, end the Soviet Union where it began. At this moment, the German army has never been stronger on paper. Entire Soviet formations have already been destroyed. Millions of prisoners have been taken. The Wehrmacht has marched farther and faster than any army in modern history. And yet, for the first time since the invasion began, there is pressure, not from the enemy, but from time. Autumn is closing. The roads will turn, the weather will shift. The window is narrowing, so everything is committed. Army Group Center is reinforced. Panzer divisions are concentrated. Luftwaffe units are reassigned. The goal is not to bleed the Red Army anymore. The goal is to break it in one final, decisive movement. Encirclement, collapse, Moscow. The opening blows are devastating. Soviet defenses in front of the capital are thin, disorganized, and already exhausted. German armor punches through with speed that feels familiar, almost reassuring. Entire Soviet armies are encircled near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of men disappear into captivity. The road east looks open again. From Berlin, it appears the plan is working. From the front, it already feels different. The distances are longer now. Fuel arrives late. Vehicles break down more often. Men are tired in a way victories no longer fix. And the Soviets, unlike earlier in the campaign, do not simply shatter and vanish. They fall back, but they keep forming new lines. Poorly equipped, poorly trained, but present. Every kilometer closer to Moscow costs more than the last. Then the rain comes. Not a storm, not a single downpour. Just endless soaking rain that turns dirt roads into rivers of mud. Trucks sink to their axles. Tanks crawl, horses collapse, supply columns stretch and snap. What moved fast now moves slowly, and what moves slowly becomes vulnerable. This is the Rasputitsa, the season the German planners understood in theory and underestimated in practice. Momentum bleeds away hour by hour. Still, the advance continues. Because stopping means admitting something the German command is not ready to say, that Moscow might not fall quickly, and if it does not fall quickly, it may not fall at all. By late October, German forward units can see the outer defenses of the capital. Some patrols reach distances that make later headlines sound inevitable. Moscow in sight. Final push. Last effort. What those words do not capture is the state of the men making that push. They are cold. They are undersupplied. They are wearing summer uniforms in freezing nights. Engines fail in the cold mornings. Weapons jam. Frostbite appears before winter has officially begun. The army that conquered Europe on movement and coordination is now fighting the environment as much as the enemy, and the enemy is no longer retreating blindly. The Soviets are pouring everything they have into defense. Militia units dig trenches on the outskirts of the city. Factories are dismantled and moved east while still producing weapons. Civilians build fortifications under air raids. Entire divisions are rushed from Siberia, troops trained for cold, equipped for winter, arriving just as German strength peaks and begins to crack. This is the moment when Germany is closest to Moscow and farthest from certainty. In November, temperatures plunge. The ground freezes solid, briefly restoring mobility, but at a cost the German army cannot afford. Vehicles start, but do not last. Men sleep in frozen fields. Casualties mount without battles. The Red Army absorbs losses and keeps feeding new units into the line. German attacks slow, then stall. They are not defeated in a single blow. They are exhausted into stillness. When the Soviet counteroffensive finally comes in December, it does not need to be elegant. It only needs to move. German units, stretched thin and already breaking, are pushed back from the outskirts of the city they never reached. The myth of invincibility shatters not with a collapse, but with retreat. Operation Typhoon ends not in triumph, but in failure so complete that it changes the war. Moscow stands. Winter arrives in full, and Germany enters a conflict it can no longer end on its own terms. This is not the moment Germany loses the war outright, but it is the moment the war stops being winnable quickly. The moment when speed gives way to endurance, when plans give way to survival. When the idea of a short war in the east dies quietly in the snow west of Moscow, Germany almost takes the Soviet capital, and in doing so reveals that almost is no longer enough. The failure does not announce itself immediately. There is no single order that says the offensive has ended, no clear line where hope turns into acceptance. Instead, the advance simply slows until it cannot move forward at all. Units dig in, not because it is planned, but because standing still is the only option left. For German soldiers on the outskirts of Moscow, the city becomes something unreal. Close enough to feel, far enough to never touch. They hear rumors. They see lights at night in the distance. They are told victory is still possible if they hold on a little longer. But holding on now means surviving cold that cuts through uniforms and boots not designed for it. The weather stops being a factor and becomes the battlefield. Fingers stiffen until weapons cannot be worked properly. Oil thickens and engines refuse to turn. Men burn furniture and fence posts for warmth. Supply deliveries arrive sporadically, sometimes not at all. Hunger sets in. Frostbite removes soldiers from the line faster than Soviet fire, and the Red Army watches. The Soviets do not rush this moment. They have learned what rushing costs. They let the cold do part of the work. They let German units exhaust themselves trying to maintain positions that were never meant to be held through winter. When they move, it is with purpose and depth. Not a single thrust, but pressure applied everywhere at once. The counteroffensive does not feel like a dramatic reversal to the men experiencing it. It feels like collapse arriving in slow motion. German units begin pulling back, first locally, then more broadly. Retreat is chaotic. Roads that were mud weeks earlier are now sheets of ice. Vehicles slide into ditches. Horses die where they fall. Equipment is abandoned because it cannot be moved. Discipline erodes under conditions no one trained for. This is the first large-scale retreat of the German army in the war. That fact matters more than territory gained or lost, because it breaks something internal. The idea that the Wehrmacht can always push forward, that if it commits enough force, the enemy will eventually give way. Outside Moscow, that belief freezes and shatters. The Soviet Union has absorbed the blow and survived, and in surviving, it has proven something the German leadership hoped never to test. The war in the East will not end in one season. Back in Moscow, the city breathes again. The panic of October fades into grim determination. Factories continue producing. Government institutions remain. The capital does not fall, and that alone reshapes global perception. Allies take notice. Enemies reassess. The balance of confidence shifts. Operation Typhoon becomes a reference point. For the Soviets, it is the moment survival turns into belief. For Germany, it is the moment belief turns into doubt. The Eastern Front does not stabilize completely. Fighting continues, casualties mount. But the character of the war has changed. Germany is no longer dictating terms. It is reacting, responding, adapting, and losing the initiative that once made it unstoppable. The soldiers know this before the planners do. They feel it in the way orders change, in the way supply requests go unanswered, in the way replacements arrive older, younger, less prepared, in the way the enemy no longer runs. Operation Typhoon was designed to end the war. Instead, it begins a new one, a war of attrition, a war of endurance, a war Germany is not equipped to win. Moscow stands not because it was impregnable, but because Germany ran out of everything it needed to take it: time, momentum, weather, and certainty. And once those are gone, no amount of discipline or courage can replace them. The road to Moscow remains visible from some positions for weeks afterward. But it leads nowhere now. What follows is not a sudden reversal of fortune, but a long reckoning. Operation Typhoon leaves behind a front that no longer moves with confidence. The German army still occupies vast territory. It still fights hard. It still kills in enormous numbers. But something essential is gone. The sense that every advance leads inevitably forward, the belief that the next push will finish the war. Outside Moscow, that belief dies quietly. German commanders begin to speak differently. Orders are phrased with caution instead of certainty. Timetables stretch. Objectives shrink. Words like hold, stabilize, and defensive posture begin to appear where once there were only arrows pointing east. The soldiers feel the change first. They dig deeper. They conserve ammunition. They stop expecting relief to arrive on time. The front becomes something to survive rather than something to conquer. For the Soviet side, the psychological effect is just as powerful, but in the opposite direction. Moscow does not fall. The government does not flee. The Red Army does not collapse. The capital holds through the worst moment of the war, and that fact spreads faster than any official announcement. It spreads to the factories still running, to the cities still standing, to the soldiers still fighting on other fronts. If Moscow can survive this, then survival itself becomes possible. Operation Typhoon was meant to destroy the Soviet system at its center. Instead, it hardens it. The panic of 1941 gives way to something colder and more dangerous: adaptation. Commanders learn, units improve, defenses deepen. The Red Army that fights after Moscow is not the same army that was nearly annihilated in the summer. Germany, meanwhile, is locked into a war it did not plan for. Winter is no longer an obstacle to overcome. It becomes a recurring enemy. Logistics grow more complex with every kilometer already taken. Replacements cannot restore momentum the way they once did. And the enemy, instead of dissolving under pressure, grows stronger with time. The map still looks impressive. The reality on the ground is not. Operation Typhoon becomes the moment when the war in the East stops being about how fast Germany can advance and starts being about how long Germany can endure. And endurance, unlike speed, cannot be improvised. It requires resources, planning, and margins of error Germany no longer has. The Soviet counteroffensive pushes the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow, but more importantly, it pushes them into a new phase of the war. One where every gain must be defended through winters yet to come. One where every loss is harder to replace. One where victory is no longer assumed. From this point forward, Germany will still fight brilliantly at times. It will still win battles. But it will never again come this close to ending the war in the East. Operation Typhoon is remembered as the moment Germany almost took Moscow. What matters more is what happens after. The realization sets in, slowly, unwillingly, that almost is no longer progress, that every failure now compounds, that the Soviet Union has survived the worst blow it can be dealt and is still standing. The war stretches out ahead, longer and darker than anything planned in the summer of 1941. And somewhere west of Moscow, in frozen fields and ruined villages, the German army learns a lesson it cannot unlearn. The war will not end quickly, it will not end cleanly, and it will not end on German terms. Operation Typhoon does not lose the war by itself, but it ensures that the war Germany wanted is already gone. That understanding settles in slowly, and it is brutal. Men who marched east in the summer believing they would be home by winter now dig frozen earth with numb hands, trying to build positions that might keep them alive until spring. Equipment meant for fast movement is repurposed for static defense. Vehicles are stripped for parts. Units that once advanced side by side now exist as isolated pockets, holding ground because retreat would be worse. The German army is still dangerous, but it is no longer fluid. The loss of momentum after Operation Typhoon changes everything that follows on the Eastern Front. Every future offensive must now be argued for, justified, supplied, and timed against realities that cannot be ignored. Weather is no longer a footnote. Distance is no longer abstract. The enemy is no longer assumed to break if pushed hard enough. Those assumptions die outside Moscow. For Soviet soldiers, the shift is just as tangible. They are still losing men, still retreating in places, still fighting with uneven equipment and uneven leadership. But they are no longer fighting with the expectation of collapse. They have seen the worst and lived through it. They have held the capital against the most powerful army in Europe. That knowledge changes how men stand in trenches. It changes how long they hold positions, how much risk they accept, how much fear they allow to control them. Confidence, once gained this way, does not disappear easily. Operation Typhoon also exposes something else the German command cannot fix quickly: the limits of planning built on optimism. The campaign assumes weather can be managed, logistics can be stretched, and the enemy will cooperate by collapsing on schedule. When none of that happens, the plan does not adapt fast enough. What replaces it is improvisation. Improvisation keeps armies alive. It does not win long wars. From December onward, the Eastern Front becomes a war of systems rather than maneuvers. Rail lines, production, manpower pools, and seasonal cycles begin to matter more than breakthroughs. The Soviet Union, with its depth and resources, begins to benefit from time. Germany, which needed speed, begins to suffer from it. Moscow remains the center of that shift, not because the city itself is magical or uniquely fortified, but because failing to take it proves that the Soviet state cannot be decapitated quickly. The leadership survives, communications survive, industry survives. And survival at this scale is enough to turn the war into something Germany cannot control. The soldiers know it. They may not speak it openly, but they sense it in the way orders come down and the way they are carried out. The war no longer feels like a march toward an end. It feels like something that will keep demanding more men, more time, more sacrifice, with no clear point where it stops. Operation Typhoon was the last moment when Germany could still believe in a decisive ending. After Moscow, belief is replaced by obligation. Hold this line, survive this winter, prepare for the next push. Each task smaller than the last, but heavier. The Eastern Front grinds forward not because either side sees victory clearly, but because neither can stop. And from this point on, the grind favors the side that can absorb loss and keep rebuilding. Germany can fight brilliantly. The Soviet Union can endure. That imbalance does not decide the war overnight, but after Operation Typhoon, it becomes impossible to ignore. Germany almost takes Moscow, and in failing, locks itself into a war where almost will never be enough again. The consequences of that failure do not stay near Moscow. They spread outward, quietly, through every level of the German war effort. The assumption that the Soviet Union can be beaten by shock collapses. The idea that one more push will fix everything becomes harder to sell. What replaces it is a kind of grim inertia. The war continues because it has already begun, not because anyone can clearly see how it will end. Operation Typhoon becomes the point of no return. Before it, Germany chooses the pace of the war. After it, the war chooses the pace for Germany. Every decision made after Moscow carries the weight of what did not happen there. Reinforcements that should have been preparing for new offensives are used to plug gaps. Equipment meant for movement is consumed by defense. Men who should have been rotated out are left in place because there is no one to replace them. The front hardens, and a hardened front in the east is fatal to German strategy. The Soviet Union uses the time Moscow buys to do what Germany cannot do as effectively. Rebuild at scale. New armies form. Production increases. Command improves through painful experience. Losses remain staggering, but they no longer threaten collapse. The state absorbs them and continues. Germany cannot do the same. Every winter now becomes a crisis. Every summer, offensive becomes a gamble that must succeed quickly or risk exhausting what little flexibility remains. The war turns into a sequence of bets placed under worse conditions each time. Moscow is where that cycle begins. It is also where the psychological balance shifts irreversibly. For the first time, German soldiers experience not just resistance, but refusal, an enemy that does not break even when pushed to the edge of destruction. For Soviet soldiers, Moscow proves that resistance is not pointless, that endurance has meaning, that holding on can change the future. Those beliefs matter. They shape how men fight when orders are unclear and conditions are unbearable. They determine whether a line holds for one more night or gives way. And on the Eastern Front, nights add up. Operation Typhoon does not fail because German soldiers lack courage or skill. It fails because the war they are fighting is larger than the tools they brought to it, larger than speed, larger than discipline, larger than planning built on best-case assumptions. Moscow exposes that mismatch. By the time spring comes in 1942, the war has already changed character. Germany is no longer racing toward victory. It is digging in, preparing to fight a conflict it did not want and did not plan to sustain. The Soviet Union, battered but alive, prepares to fight a war it now believes it can win. That belief is born west of Moscow, in frozen fields where German columns stop moving forward. Operation Typhoon is remembered as the moment Germany almost took the Soviet capital. History remembers it more accurately as the moment Germany loses the war it wanted to fight, and is forced into the one it cannot escape. And once that shift happens, it cannot be reversed. Germany continues to fight as if Moscow were a temporary setback. Plans are revised. New offensives are proposed. Maps are redrawn with fresh arrows pointing east and south. But the underlying problem remains unchanged. The war has outgrown the assumptions it was built on. Speed no longer compensates for distance. Shock no longer compensates for depth. And victory can no longer be forced by will alone. Operation Typhoon is the last time Germany believes otherwise. After Moscow, every major decision is reactive. Forces are moved not to exploit opportunity, but to prevent collapse. Resources are allocated not to achieve decisive results, but to hold what already exists. The initiative, once absolute, becomes contested, and then slowly slips away. The soldiers experience this not as strategy, but as fatigue. The marches get shorter, the pauses get longer, the fronts feel heavier, less alive. There is no sense of momentum anymore, only obligation. Orders come down, are carried out, and lead to positions that must be defended again tomorrow. The war becomes something endured rather than driven. For the Soviet Union, Moscow becomes a foundation rather than a peak. The capital does not mark the end of suffering. The fighting ahead will be just as brutal, often worse, but it proves that the state can survive the worst possible moment. And once survival is proven, everything else becomes a matter of time and cost. Time now favors the defenders. The winter of 1941-42 does not destroy the German army outright, but it freezes it in place long enough for the strategic balance to shift. Germany no longer dictates when and where decisive battles will happen. The Soviet command gains room to plan, to rebuild, to choose moments rather than simply react to them. That room is everything. Operation Typhoon was supposed to close the war by removing the center of gravity of the Soviet system. Instead, it hardens that system, forcing it to adapt and endure. What follows is not collapse, but escalation, a war that grows larger, longer, and more destructive than anything Germany originally intended. Moscow stands, and in standing, changes the meaning of the war. From that point on, Germany can still win battles, it can still inflict enormous damage, but it can no longer shorten the conflict. Every month adds strain, every winter compounds losses. Every failed gamble tightens the trap. The road to Moscow remains one of the most dangerous roads the German army ever takes. Not because it leads to defeat immediately, but because it leads to a war without an exit. Operation Typhoon ends in the snow outside the Soviet capital. What begins there is a struggle Germany can no longer control, no longer accelerate, and no longer win quickly, only prolong at a cost that grows heavier with every passing season. What makes Operation Typhoon so dangerous in retrospect is how close it comes to working. Not close in the sense of flags over the Kremlin or German troops marching through Red Square, but close in a more fragile way. Close in timing, close in exhaustion. Close enough that a slightly different autumn, a few more weeks of dry roads, or marginally stronger logistics might have changed everything. That proximity matters, because it shows that Moscow is not saved by a single miracle, but by accumulation, by delays stacking on delays, by decisions made too late, by weather arriving before preparation, by an enemy that refuses to disappear when logic says it should. Germany reaches the limit of what speed can achieve, and once that limit is reached, the war exposes everything beneath it. The Wehrmacht was built to win quickly, decisively, and on the move. It was not built to sit in frozen trenches across thousands of kilometers, bleeding slowly while an enemy grows stronger behind the lines. Operation Typhoon forces that reality into the open earlier than Germany can adapt to it. After Moscow, there is no clean reset. There is only continuation. The Eastern Front stretches on, consuming divisions, equipment, and men faster than they can be replaced. Each year becomes harder than the last. Each offensive carries more risk and less reward. Each winter returns like a verdict that cannot be appealed. The capital remains standing not as a symbol, but as proof. Proof that the Soviet Union cannot be ended with one blow. Proof that the war will be fought to exhaustion. Proof that Germany has already passed the point where retreat from the conflict is possible without catastrophe. Operation Typhoon does not end with the loss of an army, the way Stalingrad will later. It ends with something subtler and more corrosive, the loss of inevitability. From this moment on, German victories no longer feel final. Soviet defeats no longer feel decisive. The war enters a phase where outcomes are shaped less by brilliance and more by endurance. And endurance favors the side that can absorb failure and continue. Moscow absorbs the blow. Germany absorbs the consequence. That is why historians return to this moment again and again, not because Moscow almost falls, but because everything after it becomes unavoidable. The long war, the attrition, the grinding loss of initiative, the eventual collapse that begins not in defeat, but in realization. Operation Typhoon is the moment Germany comes closest to ending the war in the East, and in doing so, it reveals that the war it wanted is already slipping out of reach. From the frozen fields west of Moscow, there is no path back to speed, no return to surprise, no way to restore the illusion of control. Only a long road forward, and it leads exactly where wars of exhaustion always lead. And that road begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the weeks after the offensive stops. No banners mark the failure. No public admission is made. Orders still speak of holding, regrouping, preparing for renewed action. But beneath the language, the reality settles in. The German army has crossed a line it cannot uncross. From this point on, every success will be partial, every failure cumulative. The Soviet Union has not been defeated when it was weakest. That fact alone reshapes the future. The Red Army that survives Operation Typhoon is battered, disorganized, and exhausted. But it is alive. And alive is enough. Alive means learning. Alive means replacing commanders who failed and promoting those who adapted. Alive means factories continue to run beyond the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers. Alive means the front will never again be this vulnerable. Germany, meanwhile, begins to feel the weight of scale. The distances that once felt conquerable now feel permanent. Supply lines stretch into abstractions. Rail gauges must be converted. Fuel must travel farther than planned. Men who were supposed to fight one decisive campaign now face the prospect of endless rotation through fronts that never truly rest. The war stops feeling temporary. Operation Typhoon strips away the last illusion that the Eastern Front is a campaign that can be wrapped up and concluded. It reveals it instead as a system, one that demands constant input and punishes any lapse. Germany is now inside that system, and systems do not care about intention or confidence. They only care about capacity. Winter deepens this lesson. It forces the German army into survival mode earlier than expected. Trenches replace movement. Defensive thinking replaces offensive instinct. And once an army adapts to defense, reclaiming initiative becomes exponentially harder. The Soviet Union understands this instinctively. Its counteroffensive does not seek dramatic encirclement at first. It seeks distance, space, breathing room. It pushes the Germans back just far enough to break the sense of inevitability, just far enough to prove that retreat is possible and that it can be forced. That proof matters. Because once retreat becomes thinkable, victory becomes questionable. From this point forward, Germany will never again stand on the edge of the Soviet capital. It will never again be this close to decapitating the enemy's political and logistical heart. Every later operation, in the south, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, is shaped by the knowledge that Moscow did not fall when it should have. Operation Typhoon becomes the moment the Eastern Front stops being a race and becomes a grind. And in a grind, advantages invert. Speed loses value, endurance gains it, shock fades, production matters. The Soviet Union can lose millions and still fight. Germany cannot. That imbalance does not become decisive overnight. It takes years. It takes unimaginable loss. But it begins here, west of Moscow, when the advance stops and the question quietly changes from how soon will the war end to how long can this be sustained. Germany never finds a convincing answer. Operation Typhoon is remembered as the moment Germany almost took Moscow, but its true significance lies in what follows. After Typhoon, the war is no longer about taking capitals. It is about surviving seasons, replacing losses, enduring pressure that never fully lifts. And once the war becomes that kind of struggle, the outcome is no longer determined by brilliance or daring. It is determined by who can last longer. From the moment Moscow holds, that question begins to favor the Soviet Union. Quietly, relentlessly, and without offering Germany another chance to end the war on its own terms. ChatGPT может допускать ошибки. Проверяйте важную информацию. Смотрите настройки cookie-файлов. In the end, Operation Typhoon does not fail with an explosion or a surrender. It fails by stopping, by grinding down until movement becomes impossible, by stretching men, machines, and belief past the point where effort still produces results. The German army stands closer to Moscow than any enemy ever will again, and discovers that closeness is no longer enough. The capital survives not because it is untouchable, but because Germany arrives at its limits first. Limits of fuel, limits of logistics, limits of men who have been fighting without pause for months. Winter does not defeat Germany by itself. The Red Army does not defeat Germany by itself. What defeats Germany here is time, the one factor its entire strategy was designed to outrun. When the offensive ends, the war does not pause. It hardens. Germany digs in where it expected to advance. It plans new operations while quietly accepting that none of them will end the war quickly anymore. The Eastern Front becomes permanent, vast, and unforgiving, a place where every success must be defended through winters yet to come. Moscow's standing means the Soviet state survives. Survival means adaptation. Adaptation means endurance, and endurance is the one thing Germany cannot manufacture fast enough. Operation Typhoon is the last moment when the war in the East still feels reversible, when victory still seems like something that might be forced with one more push, one more effort, one more sacrifice. After Moscow, that feeling disappears. What replaces it is obligation. Hold the line. Survive the winter. Prepare for next year. Each task heavier than the last, each season more costly. Germany almost takes Moscow. And in that failure, it commits itself to a war that no longer has a decisive ending, only a slow narrowing of options. From this point on, every battle will cost more than it gives back. Every delay will favor the enemy. Every winter will return like a reminder of what could not be finished. The road to Moscow becomes a boundary. On one side lies the war Germany planned, fast, decisive, controllable. On the other lies the war it must now fight, long, grinding, and indifferent to intent. Operation Typhoon crosses that boundary, and once crossed, there is no way back.